Hi, listeners of GoodHard Story Podcast. We are so glad you are here today. I am talking with the phenomenal Caroline Young, what is your official title at Hope Hills? You wear so many hats. Tell me.
Director of Ministry and Culture.
Director of Ministry and Culture, both at Men and at camp. And she's even more than that, all things Hope Hills, and we are so grateful. As you know, we are in a series right now exploring the theme of invisible wheelchairs. And Caroline and I are going to have a conversation about invisible wheelchairs. So anything you want to add before we get started, Caro?
No, I'm super excited to talk about this topic with you. I remember the first time I saw the phrase on one of your slides when you were teaching at an event and had never really considered the concept before. So for the listeners, whether you have heard Catherine speak on this before, that we all have invisible wheelchairs, or you have no idea what that term means, we invite you to examine your own story while we're talking about our stories and what that concept looks like.
Exactly. I think in my story, I have fairly recently tuned into the reality from the Lord that I don't desire inspiration because of my story. Like, I don't desire to inspire people who are hearing me share or speak. What I long for is for moving them from inspiration to application, that they would not just be inspired, but apply the sort of the principles I am presenting to them to their life and their story and their specifics.
That's good. And our friends experiencing disability, some of them in physical wheelchairs, have taught us a lot about how to do that, how to apply that truth to our own lives.
Absolutely.
So, how did you come up with the idea of invisible wheelchairs? Like, at what point in your stroke recovery did you start connecting the dots between having a literal disability and a disability of the soul?
It's interesting. It was very shortly after, actually. Once, probably after about the first 6 to 8 months, I started sharing, very, very small, at a church or just to a small group here and there type thing. And the theme kept emerging that I might have the paralyzed face, but who feels beautiful even if they don't have a paralyzed face, or fill in the blank. I can't eat food yet, but who feels fully satisfied even if they can. I can't walk, who feels free even if they can. And it was kind of always this, what feels most personal is actually most universal thing that I guess the Lord really opened my eyes to shortly after the stroke. My limitations were so extreme. I think I had to pretty quickly identify, how can this be a part of everybody's
Story.
understanding?
Yeah.
Or else it would be extremely alienating to feel like, well, I'm talking to all able-bodied crowd that has no bearing in their story. So I think I learned quickly to do that.
Yeah, which is so important, because otherwise I think you would have been like othered.
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, that because she had a stroke and she's now experiencing disability, like her story must be only how great it must be for people who are also experiencing disability to resonate with her story. And the concept of invisible wheelchairs allows us all to recognize that there is something missing within ourselves that will never feel fully healed, fully content, full freedom, if we don't recognize that we are differently abled. So a lot of this comes from the theology of what you would say, how Jesus met us on earth, how he, for lack of another term, disabled himself in his humanness, like left part of his godliness behind. So when did that really click for you? How did you start to see that?
That's been a much slower burn, to recognize Jesus, who I want to think always of God the Father, as nothing as, I don't know the words exactly, nothing beyond perfection.
Holy.
And yes. Yeah. And Jesus confining himself to a human body is disabling himself, is allowing himself a human body with human constraints. And it's such a no-brainer when you think about it. Yeah, Jesus was born, incarnation, he's a human being. But you still want to think, but his body couldn't have disabilities, when yes, it did. You know, the whole notion of everyone is temporarily able-bodied on the outside is totally true. Had Jesus lived much longer, who knows? Probably he might have used some adaptive device. I don't know what was available in his day, but something. However, he had disabilities, no doubt, and yet was perfect somehow.
Yeah, he chose to enter the mess and loss of living in our world and chose to get low in order to ultimately be made high. So somehow we can too, when we identify what our invisible wheelchairs are and work through them. Like whether we acknowledge them as pain points or we seek help professionally, but when we stop counting ourselves out, especially in the disability world, like that's why we believe at camp it's a mutuality of ministry. Like we're all just helping each other along to eternity, typically able and able-bodied. And the sooner we can see that and acknowledge our own constraints, whatever they may be, physical, mental, on a soul level, the sooner we can experience freedom that I feel like you've been able to experience.
Totally. And I should clarify for the listener that invisible wheelchairs does not just mean the invisible disabilities that are also real illness. Like it doesn't just mean mental illness. It doesn't just mean eating disorders and chronic fatigue syndrome. That
are that invisible.
Too. Yeah, absolutely. Those are invisible. But I'm talking about inside each one of us, no matter what other presentations of brokenness there are, is shame and pain, haunting memories, deep suffering, grief, paralyzing anxiety, like stuff that's not categorized, you know what I'm saying, is like an illness of the body you might not see. That is definitely also real, and invisible wheelchair 100%. But not every single person is dealing with depression. Every single person is dealing with some scar from the past.
There is a lack. There is something within each of us that we are carrying.
Deficiency, for sure.
Yeah. So knowing that that's true, when you look back at yourself pre-stroke, what invisible wheelchairs do you see were there before you even had a visible wheelchair, so to say?
Yeah, goodness. There were so many and there are so many, but maybe I wasn't totally aware. I would say perfectionism has always been a wheelchair in my story. People pleasing. I would say self-worth, which is so weird because in some ways I'm very self-confident, but in others I've always had a bend of needing to apologize for taking up space on earth. And I've had a lot of therapy to help recognize like I'm worthy of taking up space on earth pre-stroke and post-stroke because God sees me fit to be on earth. And that's been, I think, a deep invisible wheelchair in my story is just feelings, or a feeling of almost probably imposter syndrome of and the scarcity mentality. Really, just all this. I got a lot of issues happening inside.
Well, as we all do, but those are all those are all things that we try to hide. You know, like that we're not quick to like admit to people around us for whatever reason. And our friends experiencing disability that have something like, you know, that you can see it on the outside. I think that's why it is so freeing to be in a friendship with those of differing abilities, because it gives us permission to show up as our full selves.
Yeah.
Like like knowing that we struggle with perfectionism, or we struggle with like knowing our worth, when we're with people who put all of that aside and are just like, I don't have a choice in showing up.
Right.
As my full
you
self.
See my chair.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
Totally.
It gives us permission
to
experience.
You've heard me say it a ton when I share about invisible wheelchairs from the stage, that I get a pass with my physical one. Everybody knows everything is not okay here in this story. She's in a physical wheelchair while I'm talking to her. But everybody doesn't get that luxury to have it on the outside where the world sees that they just need to be treated with such care, because they're
like that t-shirt you used to say that people should wear.
Yeah, totally. Treat me with care.
Treat me with care.
Yeah.
I'm fragile.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think about one of my friends who I've gotten to know the most well from Hope Hills Camp. Due to her intellectual disability, she tends to be really honest and like open and vulnerable. Like she doesn't really think too much before she speaks.
Yeah.
And one of the first times we were hanging out, she got really overwhelmed in a worship service and started to feel emotional. And so we went outside of the chapel to sit down, talk to one another. And she just opened up to me after like 3 days of knowing each other about what was on her mind and heart. And there was really no filter there. And it gave me such permission to share with her about my own invisible wheelchairs in a way that I really hadn't felt permission before.
Right.
Like neither one of us was pretending.
Yeah.
And it was such an impactful experience for me to realize most people in our lives are just waiting for the other person to be vulnerable.
Right.
Like we're just really waiting for all of each other to admit that we're all carrying something.
Totally.
But that can only happen when one of you is brave enough to take the first step. And like what you're saying with a physical representation of that, you get a free pass because it's already out there.
For sure.
So what you're really doing is inviting other people to be just as brave and bold as well.
Vulnerable. Absolutely. I think Jeff and Jordan Johnson have a podcast called Open Spaces, which you have also listened to. One of the which is, I would highly recommend it to you. It is the worship leaders in my church, and really powerful vulnerability. Oh my gosh. They say in almost every episode, like, so we're going first. We're going first. And I've always really resonated with that. I'm like, oh, I think I am too. Like, I'll just go ahead and say all the things and put it out there first. And then people can be like, yeah, I have an invisible wheelchair. It's not that big of a deal. We all have them.
And the sooner we can all experience freedom. Like if you're willing to go first and you're willing to live in the light, which is what absolutely the Johnsons are doing too in their story, is taking things out of the dark and bringing them into the light, the sooner we can all experience more of the abundant life and our constraints that Jesus is offering us.
Absolutely. Like, we love you, Jeff and Jordan. Well done. Well done, friends.
So you've spoken and written about how your actual physical wheelchair, speaking of freedom, has been the avenue to your greatest freedom, which sounds pretty counterintuitive.
Right.
So you're like, if you're listening to this now, like, well, that sounds great.
Right.
If I admit one of my invisible wheelchairs, which is like being constrained to singleness, like not having a partner to go through life with and feeling that's something that I'm lacking, how can that actually put me on a path to my greatest freedom? Like how can your physical wheelchair
Totally. And to unpack what that sentiment is, what I'm saying is that what looks like the end, the wheelchair looks like the constraint that is forever holding me back,
right,
has actually time and time again proven to be the way forward. Mm-hmm. That actually my wheelchair allows me to be in the world and to go where I want to go and do what I want to do. And the wheelchair is pushing me forward. So it's a very interesting idea. And I don't pretend to have the answer in every story of how that works.
Right.
But I see time and time again in my own story, what looks like the end actually is not. And that doesn't mean I wake up in the morning and I'm like, oh yeah, whatever seems bad is actually
Can
good.
actually be good.
Right, that's stupid. But getting creative in living your story really well, I believe, is actually an option, starting with knowing and naming the constraints in the story.
Yeah.
Seeing how to live well within them.
Yeah, knowing and naming them, whether it's thinking through while listening to this episode right now, thinking through what they may be or seeking professional help, like with a therapist, knowing and naming them does give us freedom. One of my invisible wheelchairs, I would say, is having experienced pretty significant anxiety in the past, clinically.
Yeah.
And when it first happened, like, gosh, I don't even know, almost like 8 or 9 years ago, I could see no end, like what you're saying, like to the outside eye, a typically able woman might look at a wheelchair and think like that is worst case scenario, having to use a medical device like that. Right. And when I first experienced clinical anxiety, I would say like, there is no end to this. Like I can't imagine anything worse than this like cyclical thinking and physical manifestation in my body. And yet all these years later, I now have tools to speak to people in my community and girls that are younger than me and really actually be able to understand what they're walking through. Yeah. And experience a lot of freedom in getting to share that with them.
I know. I talk about it a lot. It's extremely addictive to start sharing and encouraging other people with your story. It's how God made it, I think.
I was going to say, because we're not meant to do this life alone. We know that. And so you can only really experience freedom when you allow him to help you and then you allow others to help you. Oh gosh, as well.
For sure. I like to say we get to be living survival guides. You may have heard that, Carol, once or twice. I think you have.
So a lot of this so far has sounded, what's the word? It sounds pretty great, like in theory. Mm-hmm. But what advice would you have for a listener who's like, I really resent my limitations right now. Like I really resent my invisible wheelchairs. They actually feel really debilitating or like I'm not able to experience freedom within them.
I have plenty to say to that. Number one, seasons change. So the way you feel about your constraints may shift. I did not always feel great about my wheelchair. It took 5 years of not able to come up for air yet living after the stroke. I was not in a place to happily talk about how this was a lovely addition to life. I mean, I still don't actually say that exactly. But at some point, the page just turned. I believe our lives are stories. Mm-hmm. Stories have chapters, mm-hmm. and the beauty of chapters is they end and change, and the story moves forward. And
it might not be at the speed in which you want them to move at.
Absolutely. And maybe it's a decade. Maybe it's 15 years. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Whatever. I love the Kurt Thompson, when you're ready and not before. I've always thought that's exactly right. When you're ready and not before, then you do move forward and start to see things differently.
Yeah. That's good. I think I read recently, maybe in Romans, we have to be patient in tribulation. And I was like, there's nothing harder than that. Like having patience and
in affliction.
Yeah. Affliction in these things that we're walking through is one of the more difficult assignments.
Oh my gosh, I'm just remembering. What is that verse? Wherever it is, we can link to it in the show notes. I can't remember in Romans as well. But we put that on our Christmas card a couple of years after the stroke. To be patient
when you quite
in affliction, faithful in prayer. Yeah. It's pretty powerful.
And you had to be extremely patient in your recovery process, painstakingly. So
yeah. Wild.
Okay, so once you know that you identify you have an invisible wheelchair, you might feel some sort of disdain towards it. You're not exactly sure how to move towards freedom. How can you start by cultivating at least compassion for your own invisible wheelchairs? Like, how can you start to give yourself grace for what it is that you've identified in your life that's an invisible wheelchair?
I mean, I'm sure so much comes in acknowledging and naming the reality of what you're walking through and dealing with. Even me being aware of a tendency to perfection in my pre-stroke life is a little bit revelatory for me. Like somehow knowing myself has always been elusive. Like I kind of live, I mean, we've talked about it before. I kind of underthink things and really like just go and don't really think through what's going on in my heart and in my head. And
I feel like you started to more in the last like 3 years, though.
I hope so. I want to be a person. So I'm over 40 now. So in my midlife and beyond, my next chapter, I'm hoping to incorporate much more self-awareness and self-reflection into the story. What would you say to that, Kara?
I think you often recently with Treasures in the Dark release have just talked about how you have to befriend your own story really like before you can really even experience healing.
You're so right.
That's like the first step. So I think for me, thinking about my own invisible wheelchairs, I think I have to become more familiar with them. Like I have to befriend them first.
And the word befriend is so key because it's not saying
love,
fall in love with your constraints. No, just befriend.
Yeah, maybe just like first you identify them and say like, okay, I think I carry an invisible wheelchair of performance. Like I feel the need to overperform, that I'm not valuable or worthy if I don't show up to a certain extent. So first you notice that about yourself and name it. And then you start to befriend it almost like a third party. Like it's like this other thing over here. And then you get curious about it and want to learn more about it, and then show great compassion for it before you move right towards like, how do I flourish within this? How do I overcome it? How do I beat it down with truth? I think we just have to show like gentle curiosity towards it and be like, okay, where does this come from? How long have I had it?
Curiosity without assumption.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan. I think part 2 of Treasures in the Dark, if I'm recalling correctly in this moment, is for the healing, befriending the life we actually have. And I think that's so much of it, is how can we start to befriend the life with all the constraints that we actually have.
Yeah. And then I think once we befriend them with all these constraints, only then can we start to flourish. I think a lot about the Hope Heals community and the Mend community and what flourishing within limitations actually looks like.
Yeah.
And a great example would be our friend Griffin on staff at Mend right now is a power wheelchair user and has limited use of his arms and no use of his legs. And most recently, through a really miraculous donor story, after insurance denied his claim, was given a really cool robotic arm that was just attached to his wheelchair. And I'm like, there's no better picture to me right now than flourishing within limitation.
Yes.
Griffin's body limits him. His wheelchair limited him to what he was able to do. And his wheelchair was able to do a lot. Like there was a tray on the side of it that helped him deliver his food to the tables. And now this robotic arm is able for him to even flourish more inside these limitations. He's able to like place plates down on the tables and shake someone's hand or open a door or whatever it may be.
It's so beautiful.
It is so beautiful. And there is a lot of flourishing to be had within our limitations.
And didn't you share, it has been so beautiful to see the response of was that you, Leah, somebody, that the response of the other Mend employees, even watching it, is just so glorious.
Yeah, because it's so exciting to see. And I think that I love that about our Hope Heals community. They really honestly pushed me and encouraged me to flourish within my own limitations because no one's pretending.
Right.
Like what you always say, we put the ego aside. We put like all this stuff that we try to show up with on the outside aside when it can't, because no one has time for that.
Right. And that's why there's this electric celebration, I believe. No one's pretending. My sister Grace when she came to the dance party at camp last year. She said, "It's so wild. I've never been anywhere where there's no ego." I'm like, oh, it's just so beautiful to hear you say that, because that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, again, what else? What's the point if not that?
Right.
Like, why do we spend so much energy and so much time preserving our image, presenting it a certain way, hiding our invisible wheelchairs, polishing our physical ones?
Yeah.
You know, what is the point if not to just show up fully as ourselves?
Right. To show up fully as how God made us to be in this world.
Yeah.
Regardless of any limitation at play.
Exactly. How do you feel? We talked about this briefly earlier, and I want to come back to it.
Yeah.
So you frame the gospel story through the lens of disability, which is super meaningful, but it's also really unusual and subversive. Like, a lot of people, a lot of listeners might be like, wait, what? How are you equating Jesus, to disability?
Right.
Because we do see him as disabled in some ways, and the fact that he put his humanity aside to get low and be with us. Right. So how do you feel that the life of Jesus dignifies your personal disabilities? And do you also feel that it dignifies your invisible wheelchairs as well?
Absolutely. Since Jesus is God.
Right.
Since Jesus was God, God put himself into a human body. The ultimate dignifying act for us as human beings with human bodies is God dwelt among us. He was in a body, just like we are, with all the pain and all the problems that come with the human body. So absolutely the same is true of our invisible wheelchairs. We do not have a high priest who cannot empathize with all that we are dealing with.
Yeah. So the sooner we accept the reality that we're not meant to be whole, like fully whole and healed this side of heaven, the sooner we can start to actually fully live within our limitations.
I think so. Yeah. I hope I'm starting to do that. I hope I am kind of doing that. I say a lot to people earlier on this journey than I am, which, by the way, now almost exactly 17 years later, I'm like the old one now, telling the youngins how to do life in a chair or with a tragedy. I met with a sweet couple last week, and he is now quadriplegic after a diving accident, and he was 17 at the time, and he's a little older than that now, and newly married, and an interability couple. And I'm like, I get to kind of share how you're going to be okay, how this life is not the plan B somehow, and how you can do this and do it really well, how they both can. And excuse me, what a joy to encourage.
Yeah, I was going to say, what if that's what flourishing within your constraints looks like, to get to encourage someone else in an interability marriage, and how you can tell them that there is hope and healing on the other side, that it is plan A, that is flourishing within the constraints that you've been given.
For sure.
I think your life and the ministry of Hope Heals in general are a testament to this entire idea, but it's also proven a fact at this point that there is less of a divide between being disabled and typically abled than we assume. So again, a lot of myself included, when I started working for Hope Heals, had a tendency to other people.
Right. Like
yes. Like
camps.
Yes. I'm typically abled. This is a summer camp for people experiencing disability.
Right.
When all typically able people need to learn from their friends experiencing, or just people with disabilities in general, that we are a lot more alike than we are different because of this idea of invisible wheelchairs.
For sure. Yeah.
That we're all broken. We're all carrying something, whether it's on the outside or the inside. And how the sooner that typically abled people can do that, how might this help them as they learn to live with invisible wheelchairs of their own? Like, what do typically abled people need to learn from people experiencing disabilities?
I think you touched on that before, actually, and I could not agree more. That something about disability on the outside of the body does mean you're just a little more raw with the reality of life. And I think that's part of the magic of camp is there's this raw, real, vulnerable thing without a word even being spoken. You just, you see disability. So I can't help but think like we all need to live more that way.
We do, yeah. Because it's exhausting not to. And sometimes our friends with disabilities aren't given the choice of a veil, like often typically able people can put on a veil and their invisible wheelchairs will hide behind it. So there is a freedom that you experience in friendship and relationship with people experiencing disability because there's really no room for the veil to be there. Like
exactly. We don't have time for the veil.
Yeah. There's no room to pretend.
Yeah. Sorry. The veil's gone and nope, here we are. And you're just going to kind of show up.
And the more comfortable my friends experiencing disability are with their own constraints, the more comfortable I start to feel in my own constraints.
Right. Yes.
It somehow their friendship gives me permission to show up fully as myself.
Yes.
Which more than a lot of other friendships in my life, the more I think about it.
Yeah.
I feel I have a friend who's a listener of the podcast and your friend too, Carly McGovern.
Oh yeah. Hey Carly, we love you.
And Carly lives with CP and also a physical wheelchair as well. And I just feel like her and I's conversations are allowed to be so much more vulnerable because I already know where Carly's at, like just because of how she shows up in life.
That is so true.
And she gives me permission because of how she shows up in life to acknowledge my own invisible wheelchairs and my story, which is so beautiful. Like what better offering in friendship?
That's so interesting you say that. It reminds me actually, I was having some conversation with Carly sometime recently and told her something specific about sadness in my family. And I previously, 15 years ago, would have felt a lot of shame by speaking to this issue. And instead, I kind of just blurted out what was going on. And she just instantly said, I get it. And I'm like, I don't think you get it specifically. And that completely doesn't matter. You're like, I get it because life is hard.
Yeah. Like I might not get that exact family situation that you're walking through, but what I get is that there's something that's hard in your life.
Yes. And when she said, I get it, I believed her.
Right.
I was like, yeah, you do. And what? Like, why would I feel that way? But I felt so known. So that was really cool.
Yeah. The difference between sympathy and empathy. I think like our friends, when we admit our invisible wheelchairs, we can experience true empathy rather than if you tell someone your invisible wheelchair of like, oh, I struggle with really severe anxiety. And it's like, kind of scaring me when a friend says, oh, I'm so sorry. And then leaves it at that. You don't also have to have the same invisible wheelchair of anxiety to enter into that moment and say, I don't struggle with that, but I do really struggle with this.
Yeah.
And like, although our struggles are different, we can experience freedom together by admitting them.
Yes.
And I think that is true of our friends with disabilities. It's
absolutely.
Like our ableism is different, sure, but we are both carrying things that are hard. And the sooner we recognize that and admit it, I mean, just life is just a lot easier.
Yeah, I completely agree.
And our hard stuff, things get easier.
Yeah. Well, because it's also there's collective hard stuff. Like we all got it. Everybody's coping with. I get it. I love that Carly said that.
Yeah,
because it's all the things.
It is all the things, and I would just encourage anyone listening, like, it's okay if you're scared of what your invisible wheelchair might be. Like, like we said, but the first step is just examining it with curiosity. Then you befriend it. Then you start to understand it. And then you can experience flourishing with him and your limitations.
But as you were an attendee last year, and I was an attendee this year. We both have benefited from the tremendous work of Storywork.
Absolutely.
The Storywork Conference. We highly recommend every listener look it up when it's happening again. I know it's happening around the country, but Dan Allender and Adam Young have put on this incredible conference called the Storywork Conference. And Adam actually wrote a new book that I cannot wait to read. I just got it the other day, called Make Sense of My Story or Make Sense of Your Story or something. And I've loved the reality. You have to own your story to get started with anything. You have to look clearly with curiosity and kindness at your past to move forward. And that's not something I want to do, and I want to just go to the next thing rather than being more introspective about where I've been. And I think that's a part of this.
Yeah, you're not going to stay there forever, but understanding it is a place to start.
You won't stay there, but you must start there. That's kind of a theme.
That is good.
Well, this has been a really cool conversation, Kara. Thank you for being our resident culture, ministry, thoughtful disability theologian.
Well, it's a concept that has honestly changed my life since I first heard you teach on it. And it's helped me relate to others in a pretty radical way, whether they're typically abled or experiencing a disability. And it's absolutely helped me identify my own invisible wheelchairs and then use them to flourish within my constraints.
I think me too. I think I'm the one saying it, but I feel the same way. Like, oh my goodness, this is so powerful, and just such a deep longing, probably in every single human being, to feel like we're not alone. Yeah. So at play, like, oh, we have so much more in common than we have different.
Right. And I hope hearing that we have so much more in common than we have different. I hope this episode encourages you to think about someone that might be differently abled in your life that you've felt intimidated of. And now you can think of your own self and what you're carrying invisibly and how you might actually relate to them more than you've thought before. And that there is more in common regardless of your intellectual, mental, cognitive, physical differences than you realized.
Amen.
So I encourage you to seek that person out.
Absolutely. And if you need a place to seek that out, come to Men Coffee and Goods in Atlanta, or apply to serve at camp, or apply to be a camper. If that is where you fit.
We'll help you out.
But here's the thing. You fit with us for sure. And goodness, we're grateful for getting to chat and have this conversation. Kara, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on.